Thank you for coming today. So Dr. Vasile Stănescu is assistant professor in the Department of Communication Communication and Theater at Mercer University. So everybody, please welcome and thank Dr. Stănescu for speaking for us today.
Okay, before I start, there's a few people I would like to thank. First, I'd like to thank Paul York and the University of Toronto for hosting these series of events. I think this move towards Skype is brilliant. I think the environmental effects of flying to conferences are confusing, and I always feel guilty when I fly someplace to be talking about the way that global warming is occurring. So I think this is wonderful, as well as, in addition to cost saving, I think this is the wave of the future. I would like to also thank Allison. I've had a series of personal issues, and she's been unfailingly considerate and thoughtful, and Carlos as well as taking care of these innumerable technical glitches. There's also a few people I would like to thank that are part of this larger movement that we're all a part of, and one that I hope that you will join. My goal is not to talk at you, but to talk with you. These are people like Helena Pedersen, Stephanie Jenkins, Richard Twine, Richard White, Dinesh Weidel, Breeze Harper, and a couple of people that you will have coming here, Kim Sosha, Carol Glasser. Much like people tried to create departments of gender studies, departments of race or ethnicity or post-colonial studies, we're engaged in this crazy project of trying to create serious intellectual and activist inquiry into issues of what we term critical animal studies. And so I want to give a shout out to all these people, because we're not working somehow alone in a vacuum. And the ideas that you hear are actually beaten out of late night conversations with all of these people. And it would be impossible for me to delineate where my activism and political thought and ethical engagement and academic work ended and theirs began. And many other people who I didn't name here. New weapons, biopolitics, happy meat, and the myth of consent. There is no need to fear or hope, but only to look for new weapons, gills to lose, societies of control. Every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. Ani DeFranco. I know that in a general way, these are things you already know or have seen on the internet, so I hope that you will forgive one small example to highlight what I mean. 99% of chickens who lay eggs for human consumption are kept in something called a battery cage. It is, at its largest, the size of a single sheet of paper. And into this single sheet of paper-wide cage, they shove not one bird, but 4, 6, 8, as many as they can possibly fit. They will never see the light of day. They will never feel the wind. They will never spread out their wings. They will go insane. They will try to peck each other to death, which is why their beaks have already been sheared off. And then they stack these cages, one on top of the other, on top of the other, in rooftop enclosed warehouses. Some farmers keep gas masks so they don't pass out from the smell. This is not exceptional. This is not illegal. This is not individual cruelty. This is how 99% of all chickens who lay eggs for human consumptions within the United States live the entirety of their so-called lives. There are particular variations between species. For example, many cattle graze on grass before taken into feedlots. But in broad strokes, it is the same for a pig in a gestation crate. It is the same for a calf on a veal farm. Things are not as they should be. And yet, when people are asked to defend this system, their defense is that, ironically, it protects the animals, that they would run into predators outside, that the pigs have access to air conditioning and veterinarian care inside of the factory farm. As one farmer put it, I've never talked to a pig, so I don't know what they want. But I imagine if I was one, I'd rather be inside, where it was safe and air-conditioned, than outside and left to the elements. They make comments such as, but if it were not for the factory farms, these animals never would have been born at all. If we didn't eat them, where would all the animals go? At the most fundamental level, they argue that in some mystical or metaphysical moment, the animals have agreed, like a social contract, based on a supposed species contract, to our ownership of them, that they want to be here. This is the life they want. As the novelist Jonathan Safran Foer writes in Eating Animals, the myth of consent is perhaps the story of meat. The primary defense for hurting animals is to protect them. For killing them is to defend their very lives. I have no interest or ability to defend an apolitical and wholly academic animal studies. But along with many others, both here and elsewhere, I would like to call for critical animal studies, which draws from critical theory not simply to understand what is happening to animals, but, to paraphrase Marx, to actually start to change it. To become not just scholars who write to activists or about them, but as scholars who speak and write as activists, to become activist scholars. To critique this biopolitical justification for violence, to fight not for better farms, not for larger or more local animal farms, but simply for no animal farms at all. Point 1, the compassionate carnivore and other oxymorons. The term biopolitics and its related corollary, the state of exception, are complicated, but at their core, they attempt to understand the way in which violence occurs in order to protect others, the way in death becomes reimagined in order to protect life. One can think of the famous dictum during the Vietnam War that one had to destroy the village to save it in order to understand the fullest dimension. Destroy the village in order to save it. For example, in the College de France lectures, Michel Foucault charts how the concept of eugenics, a theory based on ending disease, suffering, and death, became a justification for active eugenics, which calls precisely these same problems. So death justified via life, disorder by order, violence by protection. However, what this means for activist scholars is that anything that can force power to display itself to be visible to the public actually represents a win. And it's precisely this point that Foucault is trying to make in the beginning of Discipline and Punish, between the spectacle violence of the king and the disciplinary violence of the prison. For power to work most effectively, it has to naturalize itself to the point that it seems voluntary, invisible, unremarkable, as freedom. In other words, the most overlooked aspect of biopolitics is its optical function. It is not, though, in Foucault, on one hand, there is the panopticon, and on the other hand, the concept of biopolitics. Instead, the panopticon is itself an example, an architectural arrangement, an expression of biopolitics in which force, the discipline and regulating of human behavior, can be rendered as seemingly normal and without force in terms of protecting and sustaining the prisoners' lives. So as activist scholars, Foucault offers us two interrelated goals. First, how to render the seemingly invisible reality of the unending violence against animals visible, and secondly, how to belie this constant, if wholly false, biopolitical justification for the continuation of such violence, i.e., that animals never would have been alive without the animal farm, which in turn are wholly necessary simply to sustain life, even the animal's own life. That is why, as both an activist and a scholar, I'm so particularly concerned about so-called locavore and humane farming. For those unfamiliar with the terms, the essential argument is that the solution to the current factory farm system is not to stop eating animals, but instead to return to a theoretical earlier time in which animals were supposedly raised well and cared for on small, local, and individual farms integrated into the community. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Food Inc., Chipotle, Michael Pollan, Joe Salatin, these are now cultural icons. On the one hand, in terms of pure numbers, this singular focus on the locavore movement may seem ill-placed, since 99.9% of all animals killed for human consumption within the United States are killed on the factory farm system. So to focus on the locavore movement, or the humane meat movement, the compassionate carnivore movement, is to focus on the less than 1% exception that merely proves the rule. And secondly, it seems misplaced in that no matter how much actual suffering occurs on these supposedly humane farms, no one, including myself, could argue that the animals suffer as much as those housed in factory farm conditions. However, my worry is in part that by drawing increasing focus on these statistically wholly unrepresentative examples of this theoretical idea of farm, it simply serves to hide from the average consumer the reality of the life of animals and our species' relation to them. For these locavore farms represent a manner in which the inherent power relations of anthropocentrism become masked in a now literal rhetoric of pastoral care and supposed benevolence. The reality is that the locavore movement can never function on anything beyond its current tokenist basis, i.e. less than 1%, as the United Nations and many others have pointed out, since it utilizes more land per a pound of meat than the current factory farm system. So the locavore movement both currently represents a movement that does not help virtually any animals at all and cannot do so in the future. The 70 billion and soon to be 120 billion land animals we kill every single year already consume over a third of the ice-rich terrestrial surface of the planet. There's simply no room for these other animals to go to, even if they all were let out of their cages. However, this is not the essence of my critique. It is in to suggest that even if, via the suspension of the laws of either space or physics, the 70 billion or 120 billion land animals currently raised and killed could somehow be transferred from the CAFOs to the local free-range and humane farms, such a practice would only serve to help render the staggering level of species violence as even more naturalized and therefore more invisible. In other words, far from a critique, the locavore or free-range movement and the factory farm system actually work together in perfect tandem, in which the locavore movement can be set up as a false but viewable proxy for what is supposedly occurring throughout all meat production, and at the same time, the statistical reality that the humane farming movement is wholly impractical in practice becomes invisible, since people are still able to eat factory farmed meat as the majority of their diet. Therefore, all that seems to actually occur via locavorism is that the consumers of higher socioeconomic means purchase overpriced humane meat, we can think of Whole Foods, which they consume to atone for the factory farm animals that they continue to consume as the vast majority of their diet. And indeed, this is exactly the case we see with virtually every single advocate and even farmers of the local or humane movement, such as Michael Pollan, the author of The Omnivore's Dilemma and the most famous proponent of locavorism, who repeatedly assures his readers that there are no strict rules and that small steps constitute actual change. Or Catherine Friend, the author of 2 books critiquing factory farming and herself a farmer of so-called humane meat, who in exactly parallel fashion, not only in print reassures her readers that they are wholly free to continue to purchase factory farm meat as long as they also purchase some happy meat as well, but even assures us that she herself continues to consume factory farm meat for at least 25% of her meals because, quote, it is so convenient. My point is that the locavore and the humane meat movement is not a different system or a critique of the factory farm system. It is instead a function of the same system in which the factory farm cannot be rendered visible. The killing of the animals which goes on constantly via the lens of the humane farm can falsely be shown. People can come and see what it's like to kill animals on a farm, even if in reality what they are seeing is nothing like what is actually happening to 99.9% of all animals, in which they will never be allowed to see. And of course, the ag laws that are currently going on make it even harder. Part 2, locavorism and the commodity fetish. To phrase the same idea in a Marxist register, in a post-Fordist economy, consumers increasingly want to feel like they are piercing the commodity fetish and the standardization of the assembly line, even if, in reality, this belief is wholly false. We know we are missing something, even if we don't actually want to know what it is that we are missing. We see this trend in the rise of pottery stores, where it's possible to paint prefabricated pottery items in order to make a gift for a friend. The consumers do not mind the materials, shape the pottery items, which are frequently marked on the bottom, made in China, or even finish the pieces themselves. You leave them there, and the workers at the store actually put them in the kiln when you're away. And at the same time, there exists an idea of making an item for a much higher price than if the item had been pre-made. Likewise, there's stores in which children can make their own teddy bears by similarly assembling prefabricated components into a bear. I was just to one at the mall the other day. I couldn't believe it, but they have all the parts there and the children think they're making a teddy bear. We can see this in the rise of open kitchens in restaurants, in which just a very small section of the food production will be visible to the public so they can see the food being prepared, even though it is less than 10% of most of the food that's actually prepared. But you have one little window. that you can see into. But perhaps the best example is the move towards the creation of berry farms, where people can, for a fee, pay to pick their own berries. These moves in which labor is reclassified as a hobby and a novelty is itself a shift and a reflection on the current state of post-Fordist society structure. But what we want to focus on here is the manner in which it serves, via supposedly a critique of the commodity fetish, to actually reinforce both its reality and its invisibility, i.e., children assembling a teddy bear at a mall bears little similarity to the mass production of teddy bears, perhaps also manufactured by children in far different conditions. Paying to pick your own berries pays little resemblance to the reality of exploited farm labor in the industrialized agriculture system. Therefore, these experiences do not represent a critique in which a certain anxiety of exploited labor practices can in part be alleviated via a wholly token, expensive, and recreational experience of playing at labor. So too, both the locavore movement and the associated DIY self-slaughter movement represents a similarly false and wholly token indite of the commodity fetish. For example, both Poland and Joel Salatin, the most famous pro-locavore speaker, speak at lengths for the need to go, quote, beyond the barcode, their term for, in essence, transcending the commodity fetish, by personally interacting with the farmer, personally raising one's own animals, even personally killing these animals. Indeed, Poland, in the two most disturbing texts of the omnivore dilemma, personally kills his own chickens at Polyface Farm and personally kills feral pigs in Santa Cruz, an experience he enjoys so much he compares it to getting high. And in turn, these practices have spawned cottage industries of individuals raising and killing their own animals, primarily chickens and rabbits. However, while these descriptions are filled with the rhetoric of transcending the commodity fetish, like paying to leisurely pick berries, it represents a way to deal with the actuality of not knowing where our food comes from, while at the exact same time still managing for these people not to know where their food actually comes from. In the first place, the pastoral romanticization of only eating locally, of meeting the farmers, of piercing the barcode, simply hide the reality of both the violence of these supposedly happy farms and the re-entrenchment of commodity culture. For example, as Foyer and others have pointed out, Salatin uses the exact same selectively bred birds on his farm, who live abnormally short and painful lives, as factory farms, and does so purely because it is more profitable. Likewise, Catherine Friend, on her supposedly humane farm, engages in castration, tail docking, and forced sexual violence of her lambs, all of whom she then sends to the exact same industrial slaughterhouses. So for all the rhetoric of knowing how these animals supposedly live, the consumers of these products actually do not know how these animals are actually raised or killed. However, since they now believe they know, the reality that they're still engaged in the politics of the commodity fetish is not relieved, but instead becomes even more hidden. So like the pottery maker or the maker of the teddy bears, what these consumers are actually purchasing is the illusion of authentic knowledge and relations which are carefully constructed to produce the appearance of better care, regardless of the reality of that situation. What they want is that label. Perhaps the best example of this marketing of authenticity or the re-entrenchment of the commodity fetish under the guise of piercing it, a kind of post-commodity fetish, is that of Niman Ranch. Niman Ranch is the world's largest producer of so-called humane raised beef. However, it is no longer even owned or operated by its original founder, Bill Niman, who was forced out by shareholders who wanted to lower animal standards while still keeping the same name and, most importantly, the same price. In fact, the former owner and founder, Bill Niman, will no longer eat Niman beef because of the current mistreatment of the animals. What I'm trying to suggest that in what is actually being purchased, the true product is in fact less the meat, or for that matter, the pottery or the teddy bears, but instead the product itself is the idea of transcending the commodity fetish, which since it is always and already itself a product does exactly the opposite. One cannot simply buy their way out of the commodity fetish relationship, no matter how much one pays for local or humane meat. Part 3, happy meat and biopolitics. However, my deepest critique of the humane farmer movement is the manner in which it serves as the absolute distillation of the logic of biopolitics. As earlier mentioned, to the degree that there is any defense of the factory farm system at all, it tends to stem from wholly biopolitical arguments, i.e., the manner in which the system helps to protect life, even the animal's own life. For example, a common attack against veganism, forwarded by Poland and many others, is that the animals in the factory farm would never have been born at all if it wasn't for the factory farm system. Now, to be fair, every industry forwards similar types of justification. For example, the coal industry likewise claims that their pollution and consequently their contribution to climate change is justified because it protects jobs, powers people's homes, and keeps America safe. They're running these ads where they used to run these ads where they would take the plug and actually plug it into a piece of coal, however that was supposed to work, and that would fuel fun. However, what is so uniquely ironic in the case of the factory farm system is the manner in which the only product which they produce are literal corpses. In other words, while other industries, such as a coal plant, may indirectly help to cause death, releasing CO2, which helps to foster climate change and therefore death, animal agriculture not only indirectly helps to produce death, lagoons of waste which release methane, which is 40 times worse than CO2, which causes climate change, which causes death, but also directly produce death, since the only product is the fabrication of corpses. Meat is, after all, simply a dead body. They are literally a factory which make, as their only product, death, and yet, at the same time, justify themselves by the claim that they are protecting life, even the animal's own life. In other words, the primary claim for raising and killing one's own rabbit is that she would have had a better life than if she'd been raised on a factory farm. Phrased in this manner, it can sound as though there's a critique of the factory farm system. However, by even more deeply re-entrenching the basic biopolitical argument, which is the justification for the factory farm system in the first place, the owning and killing of animals is necessary to protect the animals, such an argument does not and cannot represent an effective critique of the factory farm system, since it simply replicates the original justification for the factory farm system in the first place. In fact, in one of the industry-funded documentaries produced to defend the factory farm system, Smithfield Farms claims that the CAFO model is justified because it helps to protect animals and give them a better life. As I mentioned at the introduction, this film, which is introduced by Temple Grandin, explains how the pigs are safer indoors because they are safe from predators and disease, that they have access to air conditioning, so they're more comfortable, that they have access to veterinarian care. Of course, the reality is that the extreme close confinement is what is most likely to produce disease. The predator that they have most to fear are the humans who keep them locked in captivity their entire life and will, of course, kill them. But our point is not only that these claims are wholly false, but that they are in essence the same arguments made by the proponents of humane farms. All animal husbandry claim that their farms are humane farms. All of them. All farmers claim that they are better than some other farm. Temple Grandin explains how much better factory farms are now than they used to be. And most importantly, all farms claim, in the complete distillation of the biopolitical logic, that the owning and killing of the animal is justified in order to protect the animal's own life. This is, of course, not to suggest that the animal suffer as much on a so-called humane farm as they do in the CAFO system. Of course they do not. It is to suggest that locavorism, which presents itself as a critique of the factory farm system, is in reality part of the same system. There's an increasing number, actually, of earlier factory farm systems that now just have two brands. They produce the normal CAFO meat, and then they have a separate, largely better treated group of animals, which they then sell for higher prices. It's the same companies even. They've just branded it. It's like trying to get different niche markets. Hence, in the same manner that consumers attempt to ineffectively pierce the commodity fetish via purchasing, they likewise attempt to confront their discomfort at the reality of killing animals via the killing of animals. However, it is no more possible to kill one ways out of the ironies of biopolitics than it is to purchase one's way out of the commodity fetish. In other words, when Catherine Friend tells us that she raises and slaughters lambs because she, quote, loves them, there's something even more biopolitical and disturbing in this justification than if she justified killing them under the belief that they were merely automatons without feelings. Humane farmers, like prison reformers versus public execution, serves the purpose of helping to render the power relations themselves both more normalized and therefore more invisible, which is in essence the basis of their continued justification and support. As such, humane farming not only cannot ever mount an adequate critique of the factory farm system, but in fact primarily serves to institutionalize practices and deflect criticism. Hence, Temple Grandin, a pioneer in improving animal welfare, appears on a production video intended to defend the factory farm system. Point 4, Deleuze and free range. To extend beyond Foucault for a second, Gilles Deleuze, in his essay Postscripts on Society of Control, attempts to, in essence, apply Foucault to Foucault in order to illustrate strategies that go beyond Foucault himself. For example, in terms of the prison, Foucault charts how the sovereign power of the public execution becomes more hidden and in reality more controlling via the humanitarian reforms of the prison system. Deleuze, in complete agreement with Foucault, wishes to argue that these systems did not simply stop with the industrial prison system and demonstrates how contemporary and ongoing supposedly humanitarian reforms represent further control, systems of surveillance, and the normalization of pre-existing power relations. Deleuze charts how the contemporary humanitarian reforms of the prison industrial complex, such as home arrest and ankle bracelets, while seeming to provide greater freedom, allow for far greater numbers to be included into the system of surveillance and control. And in fact, this continues far after Deleuze finished his essay. Right now, in the United States, even though we have the world's largest incarcerated population, there are far more people out on parole than are even in the prison system. Moreover, to highlight an argument that Deleuze does not make, such reforms do not even trade off or mitigate the original system. Hence, we witness the rise simultaneously of more people incarcerated in even more draconian conditions, supermax prisons, with 24-hour lockdown, where their lights are kept on 23 hours a day. In perfect parallel with the rise of new systems of probation, tracking, and reporting, the result is not less control, but the development of new forms of techniques and justification of disciplining and monitoring ever greater percentages of the population. So too, these reported reforms of local, humane, or free range, like ankle bracelets for inmates on probation, while seemingly more benign, in reality, only represent greater control and the normalization of pre-existing power relations. One could write a history of the rise of the factory farm in parallel format with the beginning of discipline and punish. The spectacle violence of the butcher in the public square, contrasted only a few years later with the rise of the intensely regulated time clock of the factory farm system, which, while purporting to be more humane, after all, the animals are now safe from predators, in reality represents far greater control over the individual lives of the animals who can no longer even lay down, spread out their wings, or see sunlight. However, like Deleuze, we must go beyond these politics of enclosure to highlight that the rise of humane farming movement itself represents a society of control. For the key myth behind the entire pastoral facade of this local humane farming movement, talked about by Michael Pollan, personified by people like Joel Salatin, is that it represents a movement backwards to a time before the rise of animal agriculture at all. Indeed, this is the very rhetoric that Pollan uses when he talks about it being a farming long, long ago in America. However, what we see is that the rise of the locavore humane farming movement is not, nor has ever been, a move backwards at all, but instead a creation of a new form and technique of control in order to effectively respond to the mounting criticism of the existing factory farm system. Take, for example, Joe Salatin, Pollan's representative example of this pastoral nostalgia. Salatin buys genetically engineered chickens, moves his cattle around daily with ATVs, markets his products online to people who drive, as he quotes on his own website, 150 miles one way to buy clean meat for my family. Markets, via his website, DVDs and t-shirts all over the country, all while generating most of his current income by touring the country to lecture on the need to return to a more local and sustainable system. He flies places, to tell people to travel less. Such moves are ironic in terms of being local, but also they are false in terms of representing in any authentic sense a return to an earlier time in American history. If animal agriculture moves forward by the breeding of genetically modified animals, such a move is, in full alignment with Deleuze, a move of continuing, if less visible, control. We can now see the chickens and turkeys happily plucking away in these images of open pasture, which at the same time conceal their misshapen and abnormally large breast, the killing of all males unneeded for the agriculture production, their abnormally short lifespans, the shipping in FedEx containers across the entire country, and the reality that they become so genetically modified that they can only be bred via artificial insemination. In fact, it's even more than this. In Joel Salatin's books, he talks about all the other animals he has to kill in order to protect these chickens, including endangered animals, like eagles, and animals generally loved by even species, such as the neighbor's dog. To protect these few chickens, all of these other animals' lives have to go. To return to our optical discussion, the supposed hyper-visibility of this open pastoral farm and the open-air slaughterhouse, highlighted in documentaries such as Food Inc., conceal the intense amount of anthropocentric control and death we are intentionally not shown. To repeat Deleuze, the local and the humane farm represent not a return to a previous form of public sovereign violence over animals' lives, but instead the creation of something new. A movement beyond the politics of full enclosure. The animals are now seemingly more free, more happy, and more safe, into the societies of control, but this very freedom is now predetermined by their genetic control and conditioning, and this very safety is premised on the death of all these other animals, which must be killed. Moreover, as earlier mentioned, Deleuze makes in essence one important mistake. In societies of control, he claims that the politics of enclosure are both ending and being replaced with societies of control. As he writes, we are in a generalized crisis in relation to all the environments of enclosure, prisons, hospitals, factories, school, family. Everyone knows that these institutions are finished, whatever the length of their expiration periods. It's only a matter of administering their last rites and keeping people employed until the installation of new forces comes knocking at the door. However, as the coterminous rise of both probation and incarceration in both total numbers and the severity of confinement shows, societies of control have not operated by displacing or reducing the pre-existing disciplinary apparatus. Instead, they have operated in perfect tandem. Hence, criticism of prison can be responded not by calls of decriminalization or prison abolition, but instead by the increasing use of probation, ankle bracelets, home tracking mechanisms. So too, as already discussed, the rise of the locavore humane farming movement has not in any way correlated with the decline in the factory farm system in terms of either the number or the intensity. Hence, like the coterminous rise of probation in the supermax prison, we can witness the rise of humane farms, free-range, meat, and DIY slaughter, and the growth of the factory farm system, which is now being effectively exported to countries such as India, China, and Brazil, and is expected to double in the next 10 years. So the actual result of people raising and killing their own animals is not to improve the lives of any animals at all, but instead to bring more animals and people into the animal industrial complex, who are now simply killing more rabbits themselves in order to, ironically, provide them with a better life. Even as the factory farm system continues exploitation and increases unabated as it doubles in size. 5. Veganism, DIY slaughter, and subjecthood. Late in his life, Foucault started to articulate an idea that he referred to as the technologies of the self. The essential idea was that each of these technologies that he'd been talking about in books like Discipline and Punish, certain types of posture, sexual relations, diet, could be appropriated by the self to shape one's future self. For example, Foucault famously charted how the military utilized certain techniques of posture, head back, shoulders straight, in order to foster a certain subjecthood, a certain self within the members of the military. So in a section on the technologies of the self, he began to explore how individuals could start to use these same techniques to shape their own consciousness. I should be clear from the awkward phrase to save someone's own consciousness, the consciousness that is produced is different from the one that started with. In other words, the self which chooses to engage in the technologies of self is not the same self that such technologies produce. The idea of the manner in which certain practices can foster an internal subjecthood, the way it can shape you, is therefore our final critique of humane farming and, at the same time, the way in which we can articulate a positive solution in a version of ethical veganism and calls for animal liberation. For my final critique of this humane slaughter movement and the DIY backyard slaughter is the manner in which it can foster a certain subjecthood within those who participate in it. As earlier discussed, in terms of the 60+ billion land animals that are raised and killed for human consumption each year, the impact of one person who raises and kills her own rabbit or chicken is almost negligible, although in terms of that individual animal, wholly important. But why it matters is that it helps to democratize the subjecthood which lays at the basis of all animal agriculture, including factory farms. Now everyone can experience that moment of raising, owning, selling, and killing their own animal. The traditional lines of animal ethics, aka Peter Singer or Tom Regan, would attempt to understand these practices under a utilitarian calculus of suffering. Do humane farming practices cause more or less suffering for individual animals than the factory farm system, etc.? And as already conceded, under such a calculus, such action can appear relatively benign. And of course, Peter Singer has endorsed so-called humane meat, Whole Foods, etc. However, I would like to ask a very different question. Namely, what are the effects on the individual subjecthood of those who raise and kill their own animals? What if we understood the individual raising and killing of animals as a disciplinary tactic designed to foster a certain individual subject who engages in such actions? If merely standing in a particular manner can shape one's subjecthood, can change who you are, how much more can the action of killing? If power is, as Foucault always claims, always productive, what exactly do the power relations of personally killing animals produce within the human subject? The answer, as documented in every single humane slaughter memoir that I have read, and I think it's all of them, ultimately, is to neuter any true effective critique of the factory farm system or anthropocentric privilege, and at the same time to foster a betrayal of many of the practitioners' most deeply held values. As earlier mentioned, Catherine Friend entered into raising her own lambs in part as a way to confront gender and heteronormative stereotypes of what it means to be a farmer, to queer farming as it were. At the same time, she records examples of forcing her female lambs to mate against their will. In sections she actually entitles, "Let's Forget This Ever Happened." I don't have time to read this passage here. It's online in a video called Why Loving Animals Is Not Enough and in an article called Crocodile Tears. However, we must see such actions as more than simply hypocritical, but instead as representative of the type of subjecthood humane meat practices can help to foster. How can one ever truly be critical of speciesism or the intersectional nature of violence when they personally engage in the owning and killing of living bodies? How can they truly critique the commodification of animal life or the commodification of any life when they buy and sell life? To therefore bring this essay full circle, I would ask the same question, but from the opposite direction, from the practices of ethical veganism and the calls for animal liberation. Again, from a purely utilitarian perspective, the act of saving 1 or 2 or 5 or 20 animals is negligible in a global system in which over 60+ billion animals are killed each year. Who cares? But again, we must understand that what we're talking about is not simply an arithmetic calculus of such actions, but how do such actions shape the subjecthood of the practitioners? If killing an animal can shape a person in a particular way, how can saving one shape them in another and wholly different direction? Moreover, I want to see ethical veganism as an action which most clearly gives lie to the biopolitical justification at the root of all justifications for animal agribusiness. In other words, I want to see in ethical veganism the opposite of the humane meat movement. Ethical veganism undermines the rationale behind the factory farm system at the most basic level, that the idea that the animals want to be there. In every case which tries to justify the continued exploitation of animals, I keep coming across the identical argument that the animals have at some undetermined time and space agreed to be used by humans in a type of original social contract theory of animal husbandry. For example, Michael Pollan, Donna Haraway, Barbara Kingsolver, Catherine Friend, Kathy Rudy, all of them make this exact same argument. As Nicolette Nyman, the wife of Bill Nyman, who originally co-founded Nyman Ranch, but will no longer eat the meat, phrases it, quote, "As I see it, animals have entered into an arrangement with humans, an exchange of sorts. When animal husbandry is done as it should be, humans can provide animals a better life than they could hope for in the wild, and almost certainly a better death. That's quite significant. I have accidentally left the gate open here on a number of occasions. Not one of the animals has ever left the area. They don't go, because what they have here is the safety of the herd, really nice pasture, water, occasional hay, and plenty of predictability. And their friends are here. To a certain degree, they choose to stay." In the logic of the species contract, the individual choice of a naturalized and original moment of consent becomes conflated in a single argument. The animals have consented because it is natural, and is definitionally natural because the animal is presumed to have consented. In fact, these linkages between consent and nature are even more fundamental in that the supposed species contract presupposes that all animals have always and already consented to all acts by humans simply by being, quote, part of nature. Hence, the species contract of a naturalized consent really removes the space for the possibility of any actual consent. In other words, the speech acts of the animals seem to work in a purely one-directional valence. Via acts of supposed empathy of a foe becoming animal by so-called humane farm translators, we are informed that the animals have consented, i.e., the cattle choose to stay there. It is not the fact that animals are rendered voiceless. We're told what they want. We're just always told that that answer is yes. For example, Michael Pollan even tells us what type of grass the cows most enjoy, how the grass tastes, what a field of grass looks like to a cow. This is clearly not worlds of animal otherness as Uxel or Heidegger would suppose. Yet at the exact same time, there operates in a parallel movement the demonstrated inability to understand even the most basic ideas of animal refusal based on a supposed unspeakability and incommensurability of the animal. For example, despite Pollan's intimate knowledge of cows' dietary preferences, he assures us that, quote, he cannot imagine what it would be like for a cow to endure slaughter. If we can know that the cow wants to stay, how can we not know that she does not want to die? In other words, the animal can, indeed must, always and already say yes, but she can never be allowed to just say no. What we see of the supposed affect within the so-called humane farming movement is not a critique of anthropocentric privilege, but instead a reinstatement and reentrenchment of the most basic claims of the factory farm system. The claim that the animals want to be there, that they choose to be there, and therefore they, in some sense, agree to their treatment, and hence their death becomes the ultimate expression of their protection. In fact, it is not the case that animal agribusiness renders the animal as voiceless, but instead that the voice is only in one direction. As always and already, yes. As novelist J.M. Coetzee, via the figure of Elizabeth Costello, Alice Walker, and Saffron Foer have all argued, such an argument is wholly speciesist. Animals never agreed to be owned or killed by humans, any more than women ever agreed to be owned by men or slaves by their masters. And there's no more an original founding moment of the species contract than there was a founding social contract as described by Hobbes in the Leviathan. All are simply myths, created to justify continued animal exploitation. As Jonathan Safran Foer phrases it, quote, chickens can do many things, but they cannot make sophisticated deals with humans. In contrast, at its most basic level, animal liberation calls for the removal of cages and locks, that the animals are allowed to go free, if in reality, as the advocates of humane farming, such as Pollan and Nyman claim, the animals choose to stay, then they should in fact welcome calls for animal liberation. Why not remove all the cages? Calls for animal liberation give lie to the most basic idea and biopolitical justification behind all acts of violence throughout animal agribusiness, that the animals want to be there. What is so revolutionary about ethical veganism and animal liberation is a reminder that there are cages at all. Veganism and animal liberation operate in a parallel but opposite fashion of humane farming. In terms of either raw numbers or utilitarian calculus, the significance seems small. Less than 1% of animals are raised on humane farms, and fewer than that are ever saved by any individual vegan. But such calculus do in fact fail to miss the very purpose, their optical function, in terms of either helping to conceal or in helping to reveal the nature of violence which does affect that 60+ billion land animals every year. The humane farm, which can be toured or filmed, can be written about, turned into a documentary, talked about in speech tours, while posing as a critique, helps to conceal even more tightly than the factory farm system does the reality that cages always exist. And all retrenchment are more irrefutable, the same idea that underlines the justification for all animal farming, the myth of consent. In contrast, ethical veganism, coupled with calls for animal liberation, reveals that there are, in fact, still cages, still confinement, and the myth of consent is a lie for even the happiest of farms. No conclusion. I wish to suggest that critical animal studies and its intrinsic praxis veganism is not only about not eating animals, but instead represents an entire social justice worldview of which individual dietary choice represents simply the visible tip of the iceberg. To make an analogy, which is not the same thing as an equivalency, the boycott of segregation-based businesses in the civil rights movement, lunch counters, buses, was not only about segregation-based practices at lunch counters and buses, but about a holistic rejection of racism, Jim Crow, and segregation-based politics. So too, I wish to offer, the economic boycott of meat, dairy, and egg-based industry is not only about the violence and exploitation inherent in the production of meat, dairy, and eggs, but also about an entire rejection of speciesism and anthropocentric-based ethics. In fact, one could, at least in theory, refrain from eating animal products for, say, health reasons, a wholly humanist-centered motivation, and not constitute an ethical vegan in this larger ontological articulation of the term. For this represents, I believe, the unique and valuable contribution to the field of critical animal studies, of a shared rejection of the unique worldview that is premised on the flawed idea that might can ever make right. Indeed, while I find the term intersectionality a useful one in helping to connect various interlocking forms of violence and oppression, at the same time I worry that it misses the reality that they were never separate in the first place. I oppose commodity fetishism and capitalism because I am ethically vegan. And I'm ethically vegan because I'm ethically opposed to the notion that life, human or otherwise, can or should ever be rendered as a viable or sellable commodity. Hence, for me, the difference between the structural violence to a human slaughterhouse worker engaged in the disassembly lines is a difference in degree, but not of kind, of the structural violence rendered about the bodies of the animals who represent the slaughterhouses in product. As an expression of my own vegan practice, I boycott even non-human animal products that we know exploit human animals, such as certain types of sugar, coffee, chocolate, etc. From a critical animal studies perspective, these are not separate boycotts, but a shared worldview that the pain and death of any animal, human or otherwise, should ever be rendered invisible in the marketplace. Therefore, compassionate carnivores inherently alter issues of social justice, captured in the term animal rights or animal liberation, and transform them to ideas of mere charity, which consequently can be ignored, compromised, or abandoned at will. I believe that critical animal studies must concern itself with the lives, joys, and suffering of actual animals, but it must do so in a manner which repudiates as inherently ironic, paradoxical, and impossible either locavorism and humane meat. We must support real, concrete activism, however that term is understood, in order to help actual animals and to end their suffering. In other words, we must not only but also write to activists. We must learn to write as activists. My overarching goal would be for critical animal studies to echo Foucault's call for his own theory, to serve as a kind of toolbox others can rummage through, to find a tool they can use however they wish in their own area. I do not write for an audience. I write for users, not readers. We too must write not only for readers, but also for users, i.e. activists. Or to paraphrase Marx, the reason that critical animal studies matters at all is because I believe that it's not only our goal to interpret the world, non-human animals, speciesism, global destruction, etc. The point is for us, academics and activists both, working together to actually change it. There's a tendency I've noticed for people to respond to critiques by Foucault and Deleuze against previous acts of reform in a defeatist manner, as though no change were possible. It's all power in any case. However, such a view flies directly against the rejoinder made by Foucault himself that, quote, my point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous, which is not exactly the same as bad. If everything is dangerous, then we always have more to do. Or by Deleuze, that what we need is not hope or fear, but only to look for new weapons. To critique systems of reform is not to suggest that there is nothing to be done, but instead that what's needed is not piecemeal reform, but revolutionary actions. What we need are not better, freer, kinder, more open prisons, but no prisons at all. What we need are not better, humaner, gentler, more local animal farms, but no animal farms at all. The realization that reform always fails should not dampen our activism, but instead serve to ignite it. The meat industrial complex has kept its factory farm systems and its animal abuse. Advocates for anthropocentric privilege and human chauvinism have adopted new strategies, such as the creation of statistically false but hyper-visible happy farms. So too, we must adopt new strategies, new weapons, if you will, to reveal the violence still inherent in all forms of animal husbandry. Because every tool, even our own pens, as scholar activist, can become a weapon if we but hold it right. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, should we go into some questions? Any questions?
For the questioners, we have to go. We have to get close to the speaker. Yeah. Okay. Hi. That was great. Thank you so much. Oh. Where? Oh, right. Yeah. No. You put it down. Let's go. Yeah. Thank you. That was great. Thank you. One thing this was just a very small, it was good, first of all, it was very good that you did this, because I've been thinking about this for a long time, mostly with regard to the environmental impact of two things. The environmental impact that is not very widely reported, but we know that there's 3 to 4 times more methane with the grass-fed beef, and then we saw the argument in Cowspiracy and so on. But then what you raised, which was the ethical issue that pertains to the individual animals, I thought that was quite important in particular. And you know, it didn't matter the numbers. What mattered is that it's, you know, there's still slavery essentially going on. One tiny thing that I noticed, which was you sort of said, lumped Peter Singer and Tom Reagan into one breath to critique utilitarianism, but wouldn't Reagan actually, wouldn't his ethics actually complement what you were saying in terms of the individual rights against utilitarianism? That was just one minor thing, I guess. Let you respond to that first.
Sure. So first off the environmental impact, that's actually a large part of the research that I didn't present here, and you're exactly correct. To my knowledge, and I know of no studies which are contrary, every single person who has studied the question of is it environmentally even possible to produce free-range, organic, pasture-fed animals at the scale that we currently do has come to the conclusion that it wouldn't be, and that any attempts to do so would be ecological destruction. In fact, there is one particular study that cites that free-range cattle actually produce 50% more GHG emissions than even their CAFO counterparts. Not the same, 50% more. So you're exactly right, and I would love to read more of your work about the, I find, fairly irrefutable environmental arguments.
There's a guy named Paul Mahoney from Australia who's written a bit about it on his blog, Mahony, I think, and it's quite good. I can send it to you. on that issue, and just the GHGs. I think what also complements this as well is the fact that, and this ties in directly with what you were saying, I think, which is the whole grass-fed beef movement is, while it's presenting itself as sort of a local, sustainable, humane movement, in fact is big business. And there's a lot of these corporations that are doing CAFOs that are involved in that are actually trying to cash in on the niche market. So there was a conference on grass-fed beef that was sponsored by Walmart, JBS, Cargill, and most shockingly, the World Wildlife Federation. And so this was a few years ago. I have the website for it, and it seemed like because it is an unregulated market, they're essentially trying to sort of take over that market niche. And then World Watch Institute as well published something to the effect that a lot of what passes for grass-fed beef is raised in industrial feedlots because it is unregulated. But that saying that kind of still creates the distinction between local and industrial. And I think one thing I'm getting from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we can't make that kind of distinction. In fact, it's all part of the same thing.
It's all the same system. That's exactly right. And you're exactly correct that the move is always to water down the standards while still keeping the label. Because it is that label which is so profitable. And if you can keep the label with as small standards as possible, then that's what's going to produce the highest amount of profit. And these are all for-profit businesses. There seems to be almost a mental amnesia about how it is that factory farms occurred in the first place. If we all used to have small-scale farms, and now we have mass CAFOs, what happened? Why did it happen? And most importantly, why won't all of those same factors keep working? And so Nyman is the greatest example of this, where he tries to create a different way. Nicolette Nyman, as you know, she calls herself vegetarian, in that she won't eat the same meat that she and Bill used to produce. And yet they were forced out by their shareholders, even though you can talk to people who eat Nyman and have no idea. Chipotle serves conventional meat all the time, even though every ad you can see would claim otherwise. And the only real standards they have are for pig production. As you know, hundreds of Chipotles right now have none at all because they're having incredible difficulty finding it. Whole Foods was recently called to account because of their low standards, or the so-called animal welfare standards. So again and again and again, we see a watered down of standards in order to produce the label.
Yeah, and I have another example, which was in Ontario here. We have, there's a big ad campaign by the Ontario Egg Farmers, which is a lobby group. They're sort of like the equivalent of like NRA for guns, but they're for eggs. And what they do, their ad campaign we see on the subway and a billboard says, "Who made your eggs today?" And it shows a family. So they're presenting it factory farms essentially as small family. They are family owned in some cases, but they're also factory farms. So and then of course it's misleading to say who created your eggs today and show a picture of these family people, because it's obviously the chickens who made the eggs. So it's misleading on multiple levels.
It's a thing in California for that.
It's a good illustration of what you're saying, essentially.
That's right. And they talk about how such and such percentage of dairy farms are family owned. And it's exactly your point. They leave out that a factory farm can be family owned and frequently is. And they linked out that the total number of farms doesn't represent the total number of animals that are being produced. So even if you have a bunch of farms, any of the smaller ones are producing a very small number of those animals. But it's all a way to reappropriate this unregulated discourse of locavorism, humane meat, and compassionate carnivorism. And as I mentioned, increasing companies now simply have two brands. The cheaper factory farm brand and the same farm, the same owner, the so-called humane meat brand, which they raise at whatever level is necessary to be able to sell that product at a higher price. But it's the same place, same people.
it could even be the same animals in terms of the the milk or what have you. I don't know, but I noticed and it's working. This is this crazy thing. Like my brother, nice guy, but he buys the milk from, and I've told him about this, but he doesn't believe me, from one of these milk companies that has a happy cow on it, and it's local, blah blah blah, and so he's buying into that, and I know. You can see the rise of this industry, and so it's good that you're doing this critique of it. So, and it perfectly complements sort of the environmental critique, but yours is more of I guess, a sociological critique. So I'm glad that you've come out with this, and I don't know if you've published a paper on it, but if so, we'll certainly post it on the website and promote it. So thank you. I don't know if anybody else wants to come up here and ask, have a comment? Here, there's somebody else coming up. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Hi, Vaz. I'm Tori. Thanks for coming tonight. I thought your talk was brilliant. I remember hearing your talk on the Whopper virgins at the Critical Animal Studies conference last April, and I was really impressed by that as well. And there were two comments I wanted to make. First, I thought it was really interesting how you brought up eugenics and Foucault's analysis of eugenics, the idea that we can make groups of people, like make them live by killing off some as well, how the idea of positive eugenics evolved into negative eugenics. And and I thought that was really interesting how you seem to connect that with the business of humane farming, where the justification and even like the conventional factory farms as well, where because the animals supposedly enjoy their lives, or they wouldn't be alive they wouldn't be alive otherwise, then it's justified that they be killed. And you brought up Temple Grandin as well, and that's an irony because she is a disabled person. And when she looks at the cow, she says that she loves them. And there's a part in one of her books where she describes herself standing on the catwalk, watching the animals go to slaughter, and she says that she regretted it for a moment because she knew they were going to die. But then she said, "Oh, but if I wasn't going to kill them, they would have never lived." And I think that's a really blatant example, like just her claim to love these animals, at the same time making them die. Like that's a very, very clear example of the phenomenon that you're talking about. And I thought that was interesting. And I actually wanted to ask you if I could cite you in a paper for that reason. And also, okay, the second comment I wanted to make was when you compared the reform of prisons to the reform of the factory farm, where, okay, the prisons are less torturous than they used to be, but the mechanism of surveillance and like the number of people that can be surveilled has just increased dramatically, become much more efficient. And you're talking about how the amelioration of the horrible treatment that animals undergo in the factory farms has just contributed immensely to the normalization of carnism. And Temple is also a really good example of that as well, because the reforms that she's put in place have only increased the efficiency of the killing, and she's very blatant about that. She describes that at length in her books. And I was also thinking about a parallel with deinstitutionalization of disabled people as well, because I mean, like, if you bring this up with a lot of people, like because like they're like uneducated or they're just ignorant, like their response is just to go and say, "Oh, why don't we bring the institutions back?" But I don't mean it in that sense, but I mean that like even though like disabled people are out of institutions, which is a good thing. I mean, not completely, but like that's deinstitutionalization is generally considered to be a good thing, but at the same time, just the ways of repressing and surveilling disabled people like have not necessarily been diminished in any way. And I just wanted to make those two comments, and it would be great if you could comment on that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Those are amazing comments. I don't know if I'll be able to get to all the points that you raised. And I would like to cite your work on Temple Grandin and issues of disability, so I hope that you will let me know. I mean this quite sincerely. Your comments about Temple Grandin are exactly correct, and her arguments about increasing efficiency could not be more apropos to the point that I was making, and it would have been a stronger paper with that in there, where her humane farm allows them to make more money, to process more animals quicker. So as you know, the idea that the animals, the path that the animals go into the slaughterhouse turns, so the animals in the back can't see where the animals are going. Mm-hmm. Both, she claims, decreases their suffering, but also means that they go in faster, that they don't stop. The animals actually revolt against the way they're treated all the time. And so everything she's doing actually allows the farms to run more efficiently. So that is exactly correct. I thought your comment about the deinstitutionalization of disabled people was also right on, in that getting rid of the asylums that they were originally in would factor as a sort of like ending societies of control. But the reality is, many disabled people are still institutionalized. They're just institutionalized in prisons now, exactly. In some cases. So you still have the same, remember, we don't actually trade off. It's just they're still institutionalized and even more regimented at the same time that they're just allowed to let die because social services are cut and what have you, and stigma and optics operate. So while I haven't thoroughly thought through that, I think that's totally on, because to lose one mistake is that there's ever a trade-off. And what we see, and this is what goes with what you're talking about, both in prisons and in the factory farm system, is a ratcheting up of the politics of enclosure, rather that's an asylum or the hospital or the prison or the factory farm. They're only getting worse. And then people don't like these politics of enclosure, and they calls for reform, and these reforms are simply added on as a further surveillance mechanism or a control mechanism. There are no animals that are ever better off in these humane farms. It's not like they take an animal out of the factory farm and put them on the humane farm. That would be a farm sanctuary, right? When people don't eat those animals. All that happens are more animals are brought into the system. That's all that happens. And if someone buys from a factory farm a chicken that they raise in their own backyard and then kill that chicken, all that happened is that factory farm got more money by selling one additional chicken or several additional chickens. They got more money by selling the products that they go. Many of the coops are actually made by factory farm related industries. The person that kills them no longer feels that they can critique that system because in many ways they're now culpable, and they themselves have been changed by that process, and just another animal has been killed. They're not saving any of those same animals. They're different animals. So I completely agree. Yes.
And that also relates to Joel raising these chickens that are genetically modified that he bought from the factory farming corporations. And it brings me back to Baudrillard's idea of simulacra, where has this ideal of going back to this pristine, natural environment with these chickens running around in the field, like this idea of authenticity that doesn't really exist anymore. But the chickens are genetically modified and wouldn't exist without high technology at the same time.
Exactly right. It's a fake without a real. The so-called original farms were never lovely places in the first place. Yeah. McDonald's farm was never a lovely place. They did all types of animal cruelty, and they always have. No animal agriculture business can turn a profit without exploiting animals. I mean, it's a basic kind of Marxist idea in words like pure sense. The flesh has to be exploited to make a profit. The more they're exploited, the higher the profit. Intrinsic aspect of the market. And the chickens are a great example because chickens actually want to be in trees. They don't actually want to be in a field. The field is stressful. So this image we have, the perfect bucolic image of the chickens happily plucking, even separate from the genetic modifying, is actually not what they want. And we can't even imagine that. And then it's just added on even more. It's an interview in The Guardian while Joel Salatin, after railing about the evils for Wall Street for a very long time, the interview asked him, he says, okay, but why do you use these conventional birds? Why don't you use birds that wouldn't suffer or die, that their joints they get arthritis, their bodies collapse out of these, abnormally large breasts? And he says, we have to make compromises, otherwise I wouldn't be able to make a profit. Well, that's the same argument. And so it is, you say it's a simulacrum, it's exactly right. It's an image, and that's image is what people are buying. They see the farm. You could tour Joel's farm. I've toured it. Anyone can go. It's an image, but it is completely divorced from the reality of what's occurring. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Vasile. It's Carlos now.
Hi, Carlos.
Hi. Your arguments are totally convincing to me, as you would expect. But I was wondering, as an activist, as trying to promote the idea in the field, it is really. I'm disillusioned with humanity in general. Let's put it that way. It's just that they don't seem to get it. How can one? How can I promote this in a way that maybe they will advance towards that instead of just changing abruptly? Would that help? Like if I say, it seems to me like I'm morally inconsistent by promoting something like Meatless Mondays, for instance, which I don't personally.
Promoting what? I'm sorry, promoting Meatless Mondays.
Meatless Mondays, yeah. But because I personally, I think we should stop eating meat at all. That's my view. But how is my work as an activist or volunteering, promoting this in any way helpful, or should I just, don't even try that, discourage people who are trying to eat less, reduce? What's your take on that?
So I never want to engage in any kind of criticism by any activist whatsoever. Unlike certain people in the community, I do not think that the problem with the animal liberation movement is vegan, ethical vegans and people working for animal liberation. But I will share my own thoughts. I've been teaching classes about animals for years now to countless students. And what I have witnessed just in the time while I have been teaching is students shifting to making locavore arguments against the material that they're exposed to. And so instead of realizing the horrors of factory farms and questioning our anthropocentric relationship to animals, universally, they think they should start eating local or eat less meat. And universally, I don't think that they actually even follow through on that claim. It's just something they say. I really doubt it's something that they actually even do. It would be statistically impossible for them to do it because there just simply isn't that much humane meat. So the argument that the local or humane standard meat actually trades off with vegan awareness or activism or animal liberation or critiques of anthropocentric privilege isn't something theoretical. It's something I see in the classroom daily. The second thing I would say is I can think of no other social justice movement that was successful via subterfuge. I can think of no social justice movement that tried to trick people into doing something which is different than what the people who are fighting for truly and actually believed in it. I tell my students on day one that I'm vegan, that I'm ethically vegan, that that's what I believe, although they are more, of course, encouraged to come to their own conclusions. I mean, it's all about critical thought. But all these moves to try to hide what's going on, referring to things as plant strong instead of as vegan, or any of these other terms that I see constantly being used to market or to try to trick people make no sense to me. People see through it, they're disillusioned by it, and it doesn't actually call to people. And so in my own life, I try to be just extremely honest and clear about what I believe in, why I believe it, and how it can affect them, which is different than yelling or calling them out or anything like that. But I just mean that social activism works via moral courage and outrage, and any type of subterfuge is just going to get in the way of that. So if I believe in Meatless Mondays, sure. If I don't believe in Meatless Mondays, that's not what I'm going to fight for. I'm only going to fight for what I genuinely believe in. And even if people don't agree with me, my own personal experience is they actually respect it more. Like, this is what I believe, this is what I'm working for. Even if they don't buy it, they actually respect that stance far, far more than if they feel like someone's trying to trick or manipulate them into a certain type of action. A more fundamental reason, veganism is about not seeing living entities as a means to an end, and so we shouldn't see each other as means to an end either. I'm not trying to trick or manipulate anybody into anything ever. And I think that is itself a vegan principle. That's the best I have.
Okay. But one thing that comes from your comment is that if I, even though I don't believe on meatless Mondays as a final solution, I understand there's a lot of talks about efficiency in the movement these days. Right. As to, for instance, if people engaging in meatless Mondays, there's going to be less animals killed in the end. Right. Even though that's not my opinion, is my opinion more important than saving many animals' lives? Even though I don't believe on that, shouldn't I be at least? I can say that I don't. I totally agree with meatless Mondays, but in a way, I'm not sure if praise is the right word, but accept from the person who is trying to change that to go that way initially and then move towards reducing and eliminating at all, not to destimulate the person to do whatever they want to do. Even though I don't believe, I think there's a benefit on promoting that in a way that saves animals' lives, even though it's against my view. I think maybe saving animals' lives is more important than what I think. What do you think about that?
I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with encouraging people's small steps on the path. I was talking about
Sorry, the dog just tripped over.
No problem.
All right. Okay.
Anything can change someone's individual subjecthood. So if one person's like, okay, for one day, I'm not going to eat meat, and they have that moment of thinking of themselves as, at least for that day, a vegetarian, so there's nothing wrong with saying that's great. Every step counts. That's wonderful. It is decreasing meat consumption. Yes. At the same time, I think it's necessary to be honest with people and say, even if everyone in the United States completely followed a meatless Monday, the environmental effects would be still catastrophic. The speciest effects would be, also catastrophic. So I think that on one hand, we can, give positive feedback to everyone being on a path. You're on a path, I'm on a path, and not have to kind of participate in this kind of vegan purity contest of the 2% vegan item that's in there. And at the same time say, but the reality is that, that this simply will not work. So I'd say, I guess, it's not a great answer, but I guess I would say maybe there's a difference between the way that we relate to people on an individual basis and the way that we try to relate in our overarching advocacy for collective change.
Thank you very much.
Hey, this is Paul again. Hi. It struck me that your talk is very consistent with another speaker we've had, but he hasn't come out with an academic paper or anything yet. Harold Brown. He a lot of his talks address the humane myth, but he is luckily on YouTube a lot. So what I was going to ask is, you mentioned in your answer, your last answer, about how people are trying to fool themselves in a sense, and I think I'd like to ask if you can sort of deepen the answer there in terms of the psychology of cognitive dissonance and the way in which people, not just the way in which the industry is misleading people, but the way in which people want to be or allow themselves to be misled, and what's going on there, because it seems like if people weren't willing to do that, the misleading efforts of the industry wouldn't work. But people are, and we find that with climate change denial, we find that with a number of issues. Right. This is just another issue in which people somehow seem to allow their self-interest to get in the way of reason and facts. If you can add to that.
Right. One point of clarification, it's not their self-interest. I mean, obviously, eating meat is never in their self-interest. It's actually their self-harm. But it's still to agree with you that change is very difficult for them. And again, on a personal level, I see it with the students all the time, where my most brilliant students who can do anything, suddenly when we talk about animals, cannot understand even the most basic of arguments. And they're not lying. They're not pretending. They literally have trouble putting 2 to 2 together to equal 4 as soon as it comes to issue about animals. The only thing I've experienced similar to it is questions of race. And when I teach classes of race, and the same inability of some of my students to be able to understand even the most basic ideas of race. So there is some vested interest of guilt and denial that's been going on their whole life. You know, Derrida refers to it as a kind of like disavowal. You say cognitive dissonance. I think in terms of disavowal, which is a knowing, not knowing. You have to know enough not to know. If space aliens came to this planet knowing nothing, they would figure out factory farms in a day. How do you have a hamburger that's $1? How do you pay for the store, the wages, the bun, the pickle, the mustard, the free toy, the playground equipment? How much money can possibly be left for that animal? Where do these animals come from? I mean, we just ask all kinds of obvious questions. If they're not asking those questions, it's because they already at some level know. They know enough not to know. And so the difficulty is, and Foyer makes this argument, it's pretty easy to wake somebody that's asleep. How do you wake somebody up who's pretending to be asleep? And that's the reality of the problem that we have to solve. We don't have people who don't know. We have people who know enough they do not want to know, that look away. I mean, all the videos are out there. And so how do we wake people who are pretending to be asleep? And so you're exactly right that we can't just be like, oh, these evil industries. And every once in a while, we'll see this outrage. E. coli breaks out, or pink slime breaks out. That was in Food Inc. And they go, oh, my God. But actually, the reason these works, these pathetic, obvious, transparent lies, are because that's exactly what consumers want. They want to have their ethics and eat their meat, too. And if you sell that to them, they will ask no questions and pay whatever that premium is.
Yeah, it strikes me, yeah, exactly. And there's a very strong parallel here between climate denial and meat eating. There's psychologists of climate change denial have really explored this in depth, and I think it must be the same phenomenon. And then what happens as well is that there are methods that people use. You mentioned the word guilt. Methods that people use to assuage their guilt, such as constructing the myth that the animals give themselves to them, as you went into, and they create these complicated ways to fictions, and it seems like cultures and religions are very good at legitimizing those fictions, and then sort of working your way out of that cultural baggage is the challenge. You know?
In critical race theory, we talk about issues of microaggression. Oh, where are you from? These types of things. And I think as vegans, we actually, and in no way am I saying that these are ethically equal. They aren't. But I think as vegans or advocates for animals or animal liberation, we experience this every day. I mean, the jokes, the not funny jokes, the repetitive not funny jokes, can you still eat animal crackers, whatever they are, actually a type of microaggression. We have to be crazy. That is always the goal in any interaction. Because if we are crazy, and this ties back to the ableist, then all the argument has to go away. We have to be insane. The ridiculous hypotheticals, the same ridiculous hypotheticals. If you're on an island and there's only one pig, what is the pig eating? Why am I on this island? You know, the logic seems to be if we can construct in our mind a fantasy of why it might be ethical for one human to eat one animal ever, somehow all meat eating becomes justified in every possible case, including for McDonald's. In my experience, that seems to be the level of discourse that even very intelligent people seem to offer. And that is a crazy, to use their term back to them, system, because that is simply a type of diffusing the issue. They're simply not engaging in what we're actually talking about. How do you explain to me that that meat right in front of you is ethical to eat? That's the question I want to hear, not this hypothetical that you're constructing. So all this to say is they create these webs of microaggression to even prevent the conversation from happening. And
that's true. There's a good saying along those lines, which is that when a carnist argues with you, they're not arguing with you, but with themselves, with their own conscience. I like that one.
And the thing is we don't have to say anything. You know, there's the myth of the self-righteous vegan. But I will call beforehand. I will eat beforehand, sometimes because I just don't want to make a scene just that day. I'm too tired. I will go. I will just not eat. I won't even ask, is this vegan? I'll just not eat. And then they'll come up and say, why aren't you eating? And I'll say, you know, whatever. I mean, I won't be dishonest, but sometimes I just don't want to engage in it. And finally they'll be like, no, why are you eating? I'll say, oh, well, I'm vegan. And then they'll say, oh, you're so self-righteous. You know, immediate aggression when I have done nothing. And all I can take away from that is that they're actually, you know, the best defense is a strong offense. Just by knowing that we are vegan, it changes food to meat. It changes food to a dead animal. That's why we cannot even stand to have the idea, to have us around. It doesn't matter if we say anything. We disprove the myth that if you go vegan, you'll die.
Yeah. So the messenger is an offense to them because it implies the message, which they don't want to acknowledge. But you know, when they say self-righteous, I always think of the word righteous, because in the Bible it says, you know, be a righteous person. So I'd say the answer there is I'm not being self-righteous, I'm being righteous. I don't know. That would be my answer, but that's interesting. Yeah. But you actually go to events like that where they are serving meat and stuff. I mean, I don't.
For work.
You have to. Yeah.
Well, there'll be a speaker that I have to go and hear, and I don't get to choose what food is served.
Right.
And it's a separate speaker event, which has nothing to do with me, and so I'll just eat beforehand and go. I mean, you know, we all live in the world where sometimes there's just no option. I mean, the crazy thing is, it is actually impossible to be fully ethical vegan in the world that we live in. And so it's a crazy kind of ethics, because we have to fight for something which is yet impossible. I mean, our houses are like the subdivision is where animals need to live. Our roads stop their migration patterns. It's almost impossible, and I think cars are terrible, and I try to boycott them as much as possible, but sometimes you have to use them. And it's almost impossible to find a car which doesn't have some animal product in it, and just the act of driving endanger countless animals that are out there. We cannot live fully vegan. And so we have to fight for an ethics to count. And that is itself a fascinating experience.
That's a good point. Yeah. What do you want to say something? Ian? Anyway, anybody else? Any other?
Could I ask a question?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay, I actually messaged it to you as well, but so I'll just read what I wrote. So first of all, thank you for your talk. It was excellent. So I noticed with a lot of your work in this talk, as well as some of the other work that you've written, you seem to talk a lot about how there seems to be a suppression of information, both in society and also environmental organizations, for example. So I noticed the same thing in my work. I'm a teacher. And so I was wondering what are the ways that teachers can confront these issues when it seems like the academy and people in power, like administrators, and also the curriculum itself seems to not want to discuss these issues and seems to want to suppress them even more.
Wow, that's a great question.
Can we get him back on the screen? Okay.
I'll just delete myself as well.
Okay. I'll just say parenthetically that it's actually something we all struggle with, and that's why I'm so invested in coalition building and solidarity between all of us that are working on this issue, because all of us experience this microaggression or sometimes just aggression in our teaching and our scholarship and the people's reviews and responses to that at all levels. There's just no question. And it's similar to other fights that occurred, and it was by constant help and support of each other that changes, long-term permanent institutional changes came about. Suppression by environmental organizations, and I know it's only right at the beginning, but I'll just say that is also right on. The Sierra Club has no question about the effects of meat eating. but you cannot find it if you go to the webpage or read through their magazines. And people have actually asked them and said, why don't you make this clear to your members, since you actually admit that it's true? And they say, it doesn't poll well. We would lose membership. We would lose money. People would stop contributing. So there is an economic incentive that most mainstream environmental organizations do, that they don't talk about the issue just to try to help that organization overall. Just to give you one small example of this, there was a study done, and you probably heard of this study already, talking about how if someone who eats a standard American diet shifts from eating the standard American diet, which is very meat-centered, to going vegetarian or vegan, they would save, help the planet more than if they switch from a normal standard American car to like a hybrid or a Prius by a researcher at the University of Chicago. The Sierra Club reported on this, and they cut off just the last bit about like, if you went vegan, you would actually help the environment more. They excluded just the first part. So it was intentional. It's by that very line. So all that is to say that is exactly what we have to fight against in the academy all the time. And I don't have any better answers than we have to fight together.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I agree.
Anybody here? Well, you want to say things?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead. So Allison will have the final word here.
There's some devils on the floor on the way here. Thank you very much for this talk tonight and for coming out to speak with us. This has been really wonderful. Personally, that gave me a lot of things to think about over the next couple of days. Thanks again on behalf of me and the other organizers of the Animal Rights Academy and everyone here.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you very much.
Here.